Good afternoon, fellow cooperators. My name is Mohamed Ladak, as mentioned, and I'm a director with Vancity Savings Credit Union, also known as Vancouver City Savings Credit Union, member of Vancity, and hence an equal owner of Vancity. Also a 2012 graduate in the Masters in Management of Cooperatives and Credit Unions program offered through St. Mary's University in Halifax. So it's with great pleasure and honor to introduce you to Dr. Peter Victor. Dr. Victor has studied at the University of Birmingham and the University of British Columbia. He's one of the founders of the emerging discipline of ecological economics and the first president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. His most recent book is called Managing Without Growth, Slower by Design, Not by Disaster. And in 2011, Dr. Victor was awarded the Molson Prize by the Canadian Council for the Arts for his lifetime contribution to economics and the environment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Victor, who's going to talk to us about the question, are there limits to growth?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, to have the opportunity to learn so much about the cooperative movement. It's something that I've had some connection with. I grew up in England and would always go shopping at the Co-op, but I'm only now, as a result of the last couple of days, at last beginning to realize of the importance and the power of this movement. So the topic that was given to me, the question, are there limits to growth, has obviously been touched on by a number of our speakers, including the incomparable Bill Rees, who I never tire of hearing, though he always gives me the shivers. But by comparison, even though I tend to also be on that pessimistic side of the spectrum, I come across as a complete optimist compared with Bill. So the first thing I want to ask as I answer this question is growth in what? I think there's no doubt that there's a limit to growth in population. I think there's a limit to growth in the availability of certainly cheap oil, and I'll come back to that momentarily. The big question, and this is really the one I'll spend most of my time talking about today, is are there limits to growth in the thing that we generally use to measure growth, which is gross domestic product? I think, again, there's not much doubt that there's limits to growth in debt. This begins to become a problem. Are there limits to growth in employment? And if so, do they hit before other limits and therefore creating various problems that have to be considered? But well-being, are there limits to growth in well-being? I, for one, don't think so. Limits to growth in knowledge, no. So it really depends upon what we're talking about when we talk about limits to growth, but clearly this question was put to me in relation to limits to growth in the output of the economy. Now, the book, of course, that started this off was the book entitled The Limits to Growth, published in 1972. Now, this happens to be my copy of the book, or a picture from it. I bought the book in 1972. I say this because when we think of 1972, that was 40 years ago. That is further ago in the past than 2050 is in the future. So when we talk about how we're going to have to make all of these dramatic changes by mid-century at least, it's not a lot of time. Let me just review quickly with you some of the contents of the limits to growth. As Bill said, they produced what they call the standard run. Now, I've reproduced the graph right from the book, partly because it helps show the age of their computer systems. This is from their printer. What it shows, and I stopped their standard run at 1970 for this reason. They only had data prior to 1970 with which to build the model. And so you can see at the top, in the heavy line, resource line coming down, you can see industrial output per capita creeping up, pollution creeping up, population going up, and so on. But on the basis of that, they said, look, we were in a system that contained the seeds of collapse. Now let's bring it forward and stop it where we are now. You'll see that although resources by their measure were in steep decline, according to their projection back in 1970, we would still see output rising and pollution rising and food per capita rising and so on. So those who are out there saying they predicted collapse last century, it's just wrong. That's just not what they were saying. They were saying that the mode of performance of this system was one where if these trends continued, we would see collapse sometime towards the middle of this century. As Bill pointed out, We've now had 30 years or more of data to compare their projections with other projections. Graham Turner, the person who has taken the lead in this work, did a very careful statistical comparison, as careful as he could, of the standard run and the alternative scenarios with the data of the last 30 years. And that quote from them summarizes his perspective. 30 years of historical data compare favorably with key features of the standard run scenario, which results in collapse of the global system midway through the 21st century. And here's just a brief summary of his results. The population projection that they had in their standard run was almost spot on. These percentages at the bottom show the percentage difference between the data 30 years on and what was in the standard run projection. Non-renewable resources, Turner looked at energy, they were probably a little on the low side. Food and industrial output and pollution, really remarkably close. Now, you'd like to think, okay, well, we've looked back, we've checked, there shouldn't be any debate about at least what's happened in the past. Sadly, that's not the case. This is an even more recent paper. It came out this year in Foreign Affairs, where Bjorn Lomborg did his own retrospective. He concluded quite the opposite from Turner. He said the Limits to Growth project got its three main drivers spectacularly wrong and the other two modestly wrong. The world is not running out of resources, not running out of food, and not gagging on pollution, and the world's population and industrial output are rising sustainably. And he also produced some data. This is data of reserves of various raw materials. So what do folk like us do? We've got two people looking retrospectively. You'd have thought we could have at least solved this riddle and cleared up this debate. Well, I'm going to try to sort through some of it for you. I'll tell you about some of the things that make a big impression on me. When I was an economist, an economic student, I should say, in the 60s, and for many years after that, economists would always say, look, if resources are becoming scarce, why do their prices keep falling? And this is 100 years of data, and it shows an index of commodity prices steadily declining all the way to 2004. But now look what's happened. Things have turned around. So you don't hear the argument anymore, at least not so much anymore, from economists saying resources are actually getting more abundant because the prices are going down. At least the price data doesn't support that anymore. This index of commodity prices doesn't include energy, but I believe that the reason why we're seeing this pattern has a great deal to do with energy prices. And so if we look at crude oil prices over the last 150 years or so, the red line is the real inflation-adjusted price of crude oil, and you can see that it steadily declined up until about 1970, and then it shot up because of OPEC, came down again, and then it got that boost again in this century. Now we find ourselves still in a global recession, and yet the price of oil is up around the $90, $95 mark. And there's now, I think, real widespread concern that growth will not ever really get going again if we cannot find alternative cheap sources of energy. The person who's looked at this, I think, in the most detailed and impressive way is Robert Ayres in his book, The Economic Growth Engine. And he very cautiously concludes, after analyzing the oil and energy situation, particularly of the US, he says, although highly uncertain, the most probable forecast for US GDP is one in which growth ceases sometime between 2030 and 2040. And Bob is not an anti-growth person. That's not his take at all. He's just an analyst, and that's the conclusion he's come to. It's not just a question of energy, however. There's a very interesting study published by the EU on critical raw materials. We're always thinking of, well, can other technologies get us out of this difficulty? These other technologies have requirements for certain critical raw materials. So this study was done for the EU to see whether they were facing a resource constraint. A couple of things in this study. One is they did this map to show where these critical raw materials resided, and you'll see most of them are in the global south. That's very interesting. But the thing that struck me most of all about this study was a remark when they talked about something called environmental country risk. They said, measures might be taken by countries with weak environmental performance to protect the environment and so endanger the supply of raw materials to the EU. So you see this connection, and this is key, between environment and resources is fundamental. And here's the EU saying, or at least this report for the EU saying, those countries which currently are not taking steps to protect their environment in a particularly strict way may choose to do so, and that'll threaten the EU. So this brings me to a particular view of the economy and the environment, which I think is really important, and many of the speakers have touched on it, but I like to draw pictures, so here's my picture of how I conceive of an economy. So here we have the circular flow of goods and services. Many of you will have seen this in any introductory textbook on economics, showing how firms sell goods and services to households, households provide the land, labor, and capital, of which they're the ultimate owners, and money goes in the other direction. But this economy cannot function in isolation of the biosphere. And I think that's true of any component of the economy too, including individual businesses. But I'm going to talk at the macro level of the economy as a whole. This economy requires raw materials. And so we have this continual flow of raw materials and other ecosystem services to support the function of the economy. But the fundamental first law of thermodynamics tells us that all of the material and energy that enters an economy ultimately is disposed of as waste. In fact, most goes through the economy in less than a year. We've got two problems now. We've got problems on the resource supply side. We've got problems because in many cases we're overloading the capacity of the biosphere to absorb these wastes. That's having an effect on biophysical cycles, which has a feedback effect on the capacity of the biosphere to provide the raw materials. And all that's taking place on planet Earth. This is the perspective of ecological economics. To my mind, if we don't grasp in a fundamental way that this is how economists operate, and of course this story can be told in much more detail, then we really don't understand economics. Let's look at some of the data. This table, or this graph, shows global materials extraction, global, that's the whole of the planet, from 1900 to pretty much the present time. If you look at what happened in the first half of the 20th century, there was roughly a doubling of the materials being brought into the global economy, or economies, to run them. That includes fossil fuel carriers, so energy is included here. That was a doubling in about 50 years, but now look what happened in the second half of the 20th century. A seven-fold increase in material and energy throughput. It's no wonder, therefore, that we're now seeing evidence of planetary-wide impacts. This is a very well-known graphic, but it can never be shown too often in my view. What it shows around the perimeter are about, I think, 9 major environmental issues. At the top, climate change, then ocean acidification. I won't read them all, but there they are. And then the scientists who put this together identified what they called the safe operating space for humanity on planet Earth. That's signified by the green circle in the middle. But you can see by their calculations, for climate change, the nitrogen cycle, and biodiversity loss, humanity is already exceeding the safe operating capacity of the planet. So we've got rapid material throughput, and we've got the inevitable consequences in terms of the impacts on the biosphere. One final part of this rather glum story was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report in 2005. The very first conclusion of this report is that approximately 60% of the ecosystem services examined in their report are being degraded or used unsustainably. And they list freshwater, capture fisheries, air and water purification, and regulation of regional and local climate, natural hazards, and pests. We are a species in difficulty. Again, another graph that's quite widely known, but I think is important because it hits home the significance of the problems that we're facing. This is the concentration of CO2 as measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And you can see that the pre-industrialization concentration was estimated to be at 280 parts per million. We're now at 392 and rising. Why is that happening? Well, this is a graph taken from the last report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they started in 2000, and they did a variety of projections of what could happen to global CO2 emissions into the future. And you can see the list of their scenarios on that graph. The reason I'm putting this up is because now we can see what has happened since they made their projection. That's shown by the heavy line with the black dots on it. You can see we're bumping along on the very highest of the scenarios that they examined in their report. And this comes from Nicholas Stern's quite famous study of the economic consequences of climate change. And you'll see as global temperature change increases to the right, the consequences get far worse. Now, what's significant to me about this report, about this graph, is he only went up to 5 degrees centigrade. This was in 2006. Within 2 years, the International Energy Agency, which is a very conventional kind of a body, made reference to the fact that if we carried on as we were, it wasn't 5 degrees we would see, it was a 6-degree increase in global temperatures that we were facing. So is green growth the answer? This was the theme at the Rio conference, and it's a theme of work in the OECD and other parts of the world, including our own country, Canada. I'm going to touch on this very briefly, because I think we can deal with it quite fast. The idea of green growth is captured in this diagram. It shows GDP continuing to rise steadily. It shows resources declining. And it shows the environmental impact of resource use declining even faster. If we could have this, it would appear that we could have everything. I can't tell you that that can't happen, but I can tell you if we look at what's happened in the last 40 years, where we've got some data to go by, and we've seen a lot of technological change in these years, haven't we? We've seen all sorts of efficiencies brought in. We've seen concern about greenhouse gases. We've seen environment become a big issue. And yet, if you look at world decoupling between 71 and 2008, it's non-existent. All you have is what we've called relative decoupling. GDP is rising, energy is rising, and carbon dioxide is rising. Let's break that down into some groups of countries. Here are the high-income countries. We've supposedly become service-based economies, and yet you still see an absolute increase in the energy and carbon dioxide required to support that increase in GDP. Lower and middle-income countries, it's even a more troubling story. GDP has risen fast, but so has carbon dioxide and energy use. Now, my friend and colleague Tim Jackson took a look at this in his marvelous book called Prosperity Without Growth. And on this graph, he shows that in 2007, the carbon intensity of the world's economy of grams of CO2 per dollar of output was 768. The UK was lower, Japan was lower. And then he said, let's take a scenario of development, of growth, I should say, of growth. 9 billion people by 2050, incomes for everybody at 2007 EU levels, plus 2% a year growth. He said, if we are going to decouple CO2 emissions from GDP to meet the 450 parts per million objective that the IPCC was setting, we would have to move from this level of carbon intensity at 768 down to 6 in less than 40 years. That's a 130-fold improvement. And on that basis, he and others, myself, would conclude it's not a very likely outcome. So Herman Daly has been saying for a long time, especially for the rich countries, growth has become uneconomic. It's doing us more harm than good. And as I say, this is very, very true of the rich countries. And he says that this comes partly from the fact that unlike in microeconomics, which has all sorts of principles about when you stop, expand output until marginal revenue equals marginal cost, for those of you who are familiar with that jargon. Microeconomics is littered with principles about how to go so far but no further, but not in macroeconomics. There is no principle to stop in macroeconomics. I'm going to give you 3 graphs here which all tell the same story, and they're all telling us the story that we need a principle of when to stop. This is a graph which shows from 1945 to 2007 responses of Americans to a question about how happy they think they are, and that compares that with real income per head. And you can see that from about 1965 onwards, the 2 graphs diverged. Percentage of very happy Americans declined, if anything, while GDP per person went up. If you look at the genuine progress indicator, and we heard Ron Coleman talk about that today, and he's much to be credited for promoting this instrument, it's the same story, and it's come at an entirely different way, totally different metrics, and yet what you see is a break between increasing GDP per person and the GPI. And then Bill Rees, who was speaking on the podium just a few minutes ago, again, it's the same pattern. You can see measures of growth, human growth going up, and deviating from any kind of standard of what might be worth pursuing. So now we face, though, the dilemma of growth. Don't think we can continue to rely on it. I'm pretty sure about that. But if we don't have growth, terrible things can happen. Hence the dilemma. So let me give you an example of this dilemma. Let's suppose we have an innovation which increases labor productivity. What happens if there's inadequate economic growth? Well, as Neva Goodwin was telling us earlier today, unemployment will rise because we don't need so many people to produce the output that we had, and if we don't have the economic growth to buy the output, we're going to get an increase in unemployment. So consumption will go down, which means tax revenues will go down, deficits will go up, public expenditures will go down, loan defaults will go up, investment will be discouraged, and we'll have even lower economic growth. This is the kind of downward spiral that has the people in positions of authority and responsible positions spooked. This is a very bad scenario. The trouble is they assume the alternative is continual growth. We have to find a way down the middle. So I think what we have to do, and this is what I spend my time doing a lot these days, is tell different stories about the economy and what is feasible in our economy. And for the way I go about this is I like to try to build simulation models of national economies which examine different possible futures, because I think we won't turn the ship around if we simply say it's going in a direction we don't like. We have to know something about the alternatives that are available. So I developed a simulation model of the Canadian economy, which I called LowGrow. And I use it to try to answer this question. Can we have full employment, no poverty, fiscal balance, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions without relying on economic growth? The first thing I did was to develop a business-as-usual scenario. So this starts in 2005, runs to 2035, and it says, well, if the trends that we had experienced in Canada up until 2005 were to be repeated into the future, projected into the future, what would that future look like? And what you see at the top line, the black line, is GDP per capita would continue rising because, broadly speaking, we've had steady growth in this country. Greenhouse gas emissions would continue to rise, not quite as fast as GDP per capita, because we get some efficiency gains without trying very hard. The red line at the bottom is the government of all governments in Canada debt to GDP ratio, which was looking very healthy in 2005 when this work was done. The unemployment rate would go up, come down again. That's the blue line. But even with all of this growth, the Human Poverty Index, which was the measure of poverty that I use in this scenario, which is the UN's measure of poverty, consisting of adult illiteracy, longevity beyond the age of 60, and some measure of income poverty, would continue to rise. We would have more poor people in Canada after 30 more years of growth than we have today. Now, what would happen then, because this time I was looking at alternatives, if we eliminated all of these sources of economic growth, consumption, investment, government expenditure, trade surplus, population, and productivity, population growth and labor growth and productivity? Well, you might expect a disaster. This is the dilemma of growth. That's what the model suggests. We'd have unemployment that would be absolutely unbearable. Poverty would rise, of course. The government's debt to GDP ratio get completely untenable. We do stabilize GDP per capita at the end, you can see, and GHG emissions come down. But this is a terrifying, literally terrifying scenario. Can we do better? Well, Larry Elliott, the economics writer of The Guardian, asked the same question that I was asking. He said the real issue is whether it's possible to challenge the growth at any cost model and come up with an alternative that is environmentally benign, economically robust, and politically feasible. I focus on the economic and environmentally benign and economically robust aspects because I think I have a bit of a handle on that, but I do believe we have to show that before any alternatives can become politically feasible. So here's a better scenario, one of many. It shows the growth rate slowing until by around 2028. There's no increase in GDP per capita in Canada. And you can see greenhouse gas emissions have come well down. Unemployment's lower than it's been for 50 years. The government's debt to GDP ratio is very low. And the human poverty index has come way, way down. So here's no growth, and yet we're satisfying many, many other very important objectives. How do we do that? This is actually a long story. I can only give you a quick snapshot of the answer right now. These are the changes I make in my model to get these results. The population and the labor force become stable. We have a carbon price to discourage the emission of greenhouse gases. We actually reduce net investment. Net investment contributes to growth. If we're not going to grow, there are implications of investment. We have to redirect it as well as reduce it. We have balanced trade. We buy from others as much as we sell to them. A shorter work year is the way of getting a low unemployment rate, even without economic growth and increased productivity. And we have more generous anti-poverty programs. That's what helps bring the poverty index down. And all of those expenses are factored in to the calculation, which still shows the debt to GDP ratio declining. Final question for me, and final few moments of my talk. Can we adapt? Bill gave us a number of reasons that might make us pessimistic about this. To me, if I am pessimistic about our capacity to adapt, it's because I'm very pessimistic about the capacity of our institutions to adapt, which is, again, the reason why I'm so happy to be at this particular conference, because I can see now, better than I ever understood before, that the cooperative movement offers us a very important part of this adaptation. But if our institutions fail to adapt to the circumstances that we are now facing, I'm afraid the outlook is very gloomy. But I don't think that's the only future that's out there for us, and that's not the image I want to leave you with. I do think we can be creative enough and energetic enough, and we've got enough knowledge that we can find a better future. So the image I wish to leave you with is this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Thank you very much for those comments. And I would invite now Dr. U.S. Awasthi to share his comments and remarks regarding the presentation. Dr. Awasthi has been the managing director of the Indian Farmers Fertilizer Cooperative since 1993. He led the IFFCO to milestones in production, energy conservation, environmental protection, and sales. So please, Dr. Awasthi, we'll hear from you now.
Mr. Peter Victor, Mr. Mohammed, Mr. Doyle, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'm extremely inadequate in knowledge and experience to comment on very extremely well-researched lecture of Mr. Peter. But I have some thoughts. The world has always grown, and now we say no growth or low growth. Are we going to sustain it? Probably not. If you look at the worldwide, the stimulus package people are talking, be it US or European Union or China, or in my own country, India, everybody is trying to work on reducing the poverty. That's what most of the developing countries, they are working. Most of the developed world is saying that the environment is getting degraded. Surely it is getting degraded. Population has increased, resources are depleted. But human mind has never stopped thinking, has never stopped working on science. And I do believe that in 21st century, I am sure that another planet would be habited by mankind. The solution would be found for energy in whatsoever manner. We cannot live without energy. I mean, I also heard a lecture before where we said that we are getting towards catastrophe, where a human civilization, before it goes into catastrophe stage, we must correct ourselves. Surely we must correct ourselves. That means we have to bring efficiency into our resource use. We have to bring a solution to how to solve the problem of those people who do not have availability to drinking water or 1 square meal a day, how to take care of those who have no medical attention. How do we solve that problem? By saying there is no growth or low growth, I don't think that we can find a solution. The technological revolution through biotechnology, through nanotechnology, is trying to find a solution. If we look back, around 20 years back, we all were talking that the forest will vanish if kind of paper we use, if we continue to use the same manner. But today, see, the technology has come into IT. Now majority of us use computers, iPad, than using the paper only. So there's bound to be some change, and I think that change would be for better. I think that change will bring the change in our management of people, the change to reduce the poverty, but I'm sure it got to be done in the manner in which it is sustainable and it is good for all. Thank you very much.